A few years ago, I was driving through Washington State. Really beautiful there. The forests, the mountains. We saw Mount St. Helens for the first time. Really eerie, seeing all the old trees that got flattened when the volcano blew its top back in the 80s. That's also where I picked up one of my favorite souvenir magnets. It's the shape of Washington State with a cutout of Bigfoot in the middle. I don't do that much traveling around the US, but something that stood out to me about Washington was the amount of Sasquatch merchandise. It's everywhere. So you can't help but get the distinct impression that Washington has a lot of Bigfoot believers. I started digging into it and found out why. According to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, Washington leads all 50 U.S. states in reported Bigfoot sightings, a total of 713 documented encounters as of December 2024, and those are just the official reports. So now we know why, even though the Army likely never made an official statement about Bigfoot's existence. There was once a point when the Army survival maps for Washington had a picture of Sasquatch on them and listed it as a dangerous animal known to live in the state, right alongside cougars, black bears, and porcupines. Someone might say, well, I've never seen one. Well, with its rugged mountains, canyons, and dense forests rarely explored by humans, Washington would be the perfect place for anything looking to stay hidden. Most people that end up seeing Bigfoot are usually the ones out hiking or camping or hunting. People who spend a lot of time out in the wilderness. Speaking of the Army, Washington also plays home to a number of U.S. military bases, and a lot of their training areas are just that, wilderness in the middle of nowhere. And wouldn't you know it, along with other veterans and soldiers in the state, even the Green Berets training in Washington have reported running into something in the woods that they wish they could forget about. This is the Smoke Pit. And these are just a few of their stories. True stories of Washington encounters with Bigfoot. Since today's stories all take place in Washington State, it just feels wrong to not mention one of the most iconic Bigfoot encounters that people talk about. The kind of story that any red-blooded soldier stationed in Washington would keep in the back of his mind as he packed his gear and was sent out for a field op in the nearby wilderness. The story of the Battle of Ape Canyon. The name of the story itself makes it sound like a wartime anecdote, but it was as much of a battle as anyone could ask for. Ape Canyon is only about 2 miles to the east of the dormant volcano I mentioned, Mount St. Helens. Ask around, and it seems like all the people who live there have heard about the story. The story takes place just over 100 years ago, back in July of 1924, when a group of gold miners found themselves in a very hairy predicament. The story originated from a man named Fred Beck, one of the miners who was there. In 1967, he and his son Ronald published a book titled I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens, Washington. According to Fred, he and 4 other miners had been prospecting around Mount St. Helens and the Lewis River for the last 6 years. At the time the story takes place, they were hiking through the Washington forest to their usual spot, a gold mine they called the Vanderwhite Mine, located in a remote canyon near the base of the massive volcano. After years of working the area, they had become accustomed to it, but on this trek, Fred said that he and the others couldn't help shake the feeling that something was off.
Hank, you okay? What you doing out here? Shh.
You hear that?
Yeah.
Now, wait for it.
What the hell?
They've been going back and forth like this for an hour now. One over there, talking to another, somewhere over there. And they's getting closer.
What you think they are? Coyotes? Wolves, maybe?
No, bigger. Whatever they is, I got a feeling they's looking at us. right now.
Arriving at their usual campsite, an improvised cabin built by the men a few years earlier, Fred and the men settled in. Things were business as usual for a couple of days. But then, almost every night, the men began hearing strange noises. Fred described the sounds in his book.
We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge, and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound, which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on its chest.
In spite of the strange sounds and Fred suffering from a bad toothache, all in all, the men's dig was going well. Spirits were high. One day, while taking a breather from digging in the hot sun, Fred went with another guy, Hank, to fetch some water from a nearby spring. Fred had just stooped down by the water to fill his bucket when Hank yelled. Fred whipped around to see that Hank, now facing away from him, was pointing his rifle at something in the trees about 100 yards away.
Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away on the other side of a little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree, and at the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree from each of his 3 shots. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view.
Terrified, the 2 men quickly filled their buckets and ran, water sloshing out of them, all the way back to the cabin. It took some time to catch their breath, but once they did, they told their friends about what they'd just seen down by the creek. Fred and Hank were clearly terrified by the encounter. The other 3 agreed that they would stay one more night and then leave the canyon the next morning and head back to town. Problem was, that would soon become the most terrifying night of their lives. Around midnight, the miners were suddenly woken up by loud banging noises against the cabin. It sounded like large rocks were being thrown at it. Sure enough, something was throwing rocks at them, big ones, big enough that they were starting to splinter the stacked logs that made up the cabin walls. The men grabbed their rifles and pistols, unsure of what to do. Going outside certainly seemed like the worst idea. The cabin didn't have any windows, but the massive rocks were starting to break open small gaps between the logs. The men used these to try to see what was outside. What they saw horrified them. Their cabin was surrounded by at least 3 large, hairy creatures standing on 2 legs. They watched the creatures moving around the cabin, picking up large boulders and hurling them towards it. Whatever these things were, they could tell they weren't human, but they seemed far more intelligent than most animals.
The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking had we chosen to shoot. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, but this was pretty much an impossibility. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the gap in the wall and grabbed one of our axes by the handle. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I turned the head of the axe upright so that it caught on the logs, and at the same time Hank shot, barely missing my hand.
None of the men slept that night. The attacks continued until dawn. Only when it started to get light, the creatures finally appeared to leave. The men weren't sure if they would get another chance, so they took the opportunity to leave the area themselves. They thought it was best to leave most of the gear behind, since it would slow them down. Hopefully, they'd be able to come back another time and get it. But even if not, their lives were more valuable. Grabbing their weapons, after one final look through the gaps in the walls, they removed the wood brace from the door and cautiously stepped outside. But after scanning the surrounding canyon, it was Fred who saw it first, one of the creatures standing near the edge of a nearby cliff.
It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures standing about 80 yards away near the edge of the canyon. I shot 3 times and it toppled over the cliff down into the gorge, some 400 feet below.
For reasons we can only guess, although completely understandable, Fred said that he and the other men all agreed to say nothing about the incident to anyone. In the end, they were so disturbed by the whole ordeal that they decided to never go back to the Vanderwhite mine. No amount of gold was worth dying for. In spite of their agreement, the story eventually got out. Frank said in his book that his friend Hank spilled the beans and reported the incident to the local park rangers. Maybe he had hoped to make sure nobody got hurt from wandering into the area themselves. But from there, things snowballed until the story of the so-called Mountain Devils was making headlines. Thousands of people flocked to what was eventually dubbed Ape Canyon from all over the country, hoping to catch a glimpse of the strange creatures seen by a group of gold miners. Even a well-known big game hunter armed with an elephant gun traveled all the way from England with hopes of bagging one for his exotic collection. Despite being hounded by reporters, Fred and the other men were never known to speak openly about what had happened, at least not without a lot of persistence. Fred would eventually be goaded into leading 2 reporters and a park ranger back to the cabin site. Fred also left most of their names out of his book for their own privacy. 2 of the men's identities remain unknown. Aside from Fred's book, the only reason we do know more about the men involved is because their family members eventually came forward about the incident many years later. The names of 3 of the men are generally accepted to be Leroy Smith, Marion Smith, though it's unclear if they're related, and of course, Fred Beck. Frank later clarified that the man he referred to in his book as Hank was a pseudonym he used, since the man he was referring to was a key figure in the story, what with his telling the park rangers about the story, and the whole thing ending up getting out of control and being released to the public. Probably because of their unwillingness to speak about it, a lot of questions remain unanswered. In the 100 years since the Battle of Ape Canyon, the site of the encounter has changed significantly, thanks to the 1981 eruption of Mount St. Helens. However, in 2013, researcher Mark Mersell located what he believed to be the foundations of the cabin used by the miners. Ominously, Mark said that, buried in the dirt, he found numerous spent shell casings. These would match to the rifles Fred Beck said that he and Hank were carrying on the night of the attack. All of this to say, whatever we think about these creatures, based on Fred's story, it seems that they might be territorial. They can also be highly aggressive, and even gunfire might not be enough to keep them away. But unfortunately, because of the Army's safety regulations, most soldiers training in the field don't actually carry live ammunition with them. These following stories would have us wondering if the soldiers training in the woods of Washington shouldn't be given some kind of exception to this rule. This next story was shared by a soldier serving with the Green Berets, the U.S. Army's branch of SOCOM, the Special Operations Command. I never worked directly with the Green Berets. I worked on the Marine Corps side of SOCOM during my second enlistment. But of course, whether it's the Raiders, Green Berets, SEALs, or PJs, I'm sure we all talk crap about who's the toughest. But compared to conventional military forces, you can imagine that special ops guys all have a reputation for being tough as nails. But just reading this guy's story, I don't blame him for being as unnerved as he was. He asked to remain anonymous. During some PMT drills, or pre-mission training, that he was conducting on Fort Lewis in Washington, he recounted what happened to him while patrolling through the woods at night with his team. 2006, Fort Lewis, Washington. I was previously deployed to Bosnia and Afghanistan and was the 18th Charlie Special Forces engineer on the team. We were doing an exercise, patrolling, reacting to contact, and breaking contact drills during PMT before we deployed to Iraq. We were in one of the really remote training areas of Fort Lewis. The whole exercise was kind of last minute, so it was all we had available. We were near the towns of Rainier and Yelm in an area called Skookumchuck, super remote and basically in the shadow of Mount Rainier. At night, we would go to 33% security in our patrol base, but we kept coming into contact with something that none of us could figure out. We would see figures and shapes moving in the shadows and could hear foliage snapping. Fort Lewis is cloudy 90% of the time, so night vision goggles were practically useless, but we had them. The thermals that we had been using back then were okay, but they burned through batteries and were heavy, so we didn't take them. We left them in the arms room. At first, we thought that these noises and all this stuff going on might be local hillbillies and rednecks up to no good, tracking us. I mean, a dozen full auto M4s with lasers, optics, night vision goggles, and radios is worth a lot of money. They might have been trying to steal them. Out in Washington, we knew there were bears, large cats, and other wildlife, so even though our command didn't know about it, we all carried 2 mags of unaccounted for range ammo, just in case. We had basically taken the ammo off the range when nobody was looking. But eventually, we bumped up from 33% to 50% security, so half of our guys are awake, and our team sergeant and commander decided that training was over. The liability of whatever was going on out there wasn't worth the squeeze, so to speak. Soon the order was given. Live mags were loaded, but no rounds chambered. Not yet, anyway. We started backtracking on the trail we came in on, but my senior said something was off. And then we saw them. Tracks. They were hard to make out in the dark, but they were large. And they were set deep into the mud, like whoever they belonged to was weighed down with gear. Our initial thought was that it was the locals wearing the same kind of boots as us. At this point, we were still convinced that we were dealing with sketchy hillbillies, and the thought of messing with them a little was too good to pass up. A little payback for screwing with us, you know. So we picked up a trail and started tracking them. We could smell it before we found it. This sickly sweet smell of rotten flesh, wet dog fur, and dung. Green Berets are supposed to be able to handle anything, stuff that would even make a billy goat puke, but this was rough. Me and another teammate dropped rucks and went ahead to scout, while the team set up a linear counter-ambush and patrol base. We found a clearing in the forest, kind of like a deer or elk bedding area, but with tree limbs and brush laid down, like a bed you'd learn to make in survival school. The smell made us want to leave immediately, but what was even scarier was that the limbs were broken off all the trees around us and up to a height of twice our own height. I spotted some hair. It looked like an elk or a deer at first, but then I got a closer look. In the little bit of light that we had, I took it to be brown, maybe reddish, but it was coarse and thick, like hog hair. We then reported our findings. Everyone was thinking it, but no one was saying it. It was still a few hours until morning, and we weren't afraid of a fight, but a warm, dry team room with beer and pizza sounded way better than staying in the field with what was possibly out there with us. So we threw on our rucks and patrolled to the nearest road, which was pretty far off. And the whole time, we could all hear and feel that we were being followed, but from a distance. You could almost feel a level of mutual respect in the mountain air. They must have known we were different from other humans because of the way we moved, slowly, tactically conserving our energy, ready for a fight if it came to it. We'd clearly worn out our welcome in that remote training area, but if it came to a fight, we each had 60 rounds and knew how to use them. Just as it was getting light and everyone's nerves were on edge, we saw headlights on the road. It was an LMTV, and we flagged it down and got a ride back to the compound. To this day, I still believe that we stumbled into the territory of more than one Sasquatch. And if we'd acted any differently, things could have turned out badly for both sides. This next story was found in the book Encounters in the Woods, Volume 1 by Ethan Hayes. The account, written by the son of a Marine Corps veteran, details a chilling run-in that the two had while hiking along a remote trail in Washington. It was fall, and I was hiking with my dad. I hadn't seen him in a while, and we both hadn't been out hiking in a long time. I researched some trails, looking for one that was off the beaten path. One thing I didn't want to do was get stuck behind a bunch of people or have to worry about parking. I found a spot about an hour away, a ways out from the city. The park sat on the edge of a national forest. I'd say exactly, but I don't want to spoil the place, nor do I want a group of Bigfoot people racing into the area. We set out that morning. It was cool and crisp, and according to the weather report, we were going to have clear skies to enjoy our day. We arrived at the trailhead about mid-morning and planned on making it a solid 2-hour hike. For being 68, my dad was in pretty good shape. Heck, after our first climb, I was wondering if he was in better shape than I was. My dad had been a Marine and prided himself on his fitness, and it showed. The reviews of the hiking spot were spot on. It was remote, no one to be seen, and there wasn't even a car in the parking lot. Outside of the initial climb, the first hour of the hike proved to be relatively flat and easy. We crossed over several large fields and had a forest of pines to go through before we turned to head back. When we entered the forest, the bright sunlit morning was dimmed by the shadows of the thick pine grove. We both stopped and took it all in. It was beautiful. My dad pulled out his old camera and started snapping some photos, some with me in them, some of just trees and nature and stuff. He swung his camera to the right and peered through the viewfinder, and it was then that he let out a sharp gasp. He lowered the camera and started pointing out into the woods. When he called my name, I could hear the fear in his voice. He took a few big steps backwards, still pointing, and then he tripped over a fallen tree. All I heard was a loud thud and crack. I didn't see what he was looking at, but I turned just in time to see him falling onto the ground. His leg bent the wrong way, completely the wrong way, like bone jutting out and everything, and he is howling in pain. So I run over to him, and I'll admit I totally freaked out for a second. I just froze, but I got it together and I started to perform basic first aid. I compressed the open wound. Using some cloth, I wrapped it as tightly as I could. Through his grunts of pain, my dad is asking me, "Did you see it?" I asked him what he meant, and he replied, "The monster." I didn't process what he was saying until after I finished wrapping his leg. His arms shook as he tried to sit up, and he's saying, "There, over there. I saw it standing over there." I looked to where he was pointing, and I didn't see anything but pine trees. So now my mind is racing. How am I going to get him out of there without making his leg worse? I pulled my phone out, and of course, there wasn't a signal this far out. I was so frustrated, but the situation was what it was. As my dad went on about this hairy, 7-foot-tall monster, I kind of just rolled my eyes. In my mind, my dad is clearly going into shock. I took off my backpack and pulled out a water bottle, urging him to drink and rest so I could try to think of a plan to get us out of here. But he wasn't having any of it. He just wanted to leave right away. So I made him a deal. If I went to investigate what he saw, he would take a moment to rest and get some water in him. He nodded in agreement and took the water bottle. I got up and turned to look where he saw this monster. And again, all I saw was just tall pine trees and some small saplings, which were scattered along the ground. I took a few steps, but then stopped when I heard a branch snap loudly to my left. I looked, but nothing, just more trees. I stared for a minute, ready to just write all this off, when I saw something move. At first, I thought it was the wind blowing a branch or leaves, but these were pines, and pines don't have leaves. And it was too low, down on a tree, to be a branch. I kept my eyes glued to the spot, because something was there. Something dark that was just barely sticking out from the side of the tree. My mind went into overdrive trying to think of a normal explanation, but I was starting to get worried. What could this be blowing in the breeze? Because it sure as hell looked like long hair. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and looked again. Gone. It was just gone. My heart sank, and I had this gnawing sensation starting in my gut. If it was no longer there, then whatever it was had moved. And if it had moved, then whatever it was alive. My dad called out to me, asking what I was looking at. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to admit that maybe he was right. I have always thought about myself as a science guy, and a monster in the woods, that just wasn't science. That was science fiction at best. Hell, it was pseudoscience. Dad called out to me again, but I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where I thought I saw something. And it was then that I heard my dad cry out in pain. I was about to turn my attention towards him when whatever the hell was watching us peeked out from around the tree for a split second. At the sight of it, I nearly fell over in shock. It was a face, a human-like face, but it wasn't human. It's hard to explain. It had all the features of a human face, but it simply was not human. Many of the features were larger or slightly different, and its head was elongated at the top or cone-shaped. The face had hair, and where there wasn't, the skin was grayish in color. Its eyes were large, and its nose was flat and wide. I took a few steps back, my eyes still glued on where I'd seen the face pop out, before turning back and running towards my dad. By the look on my face, he knew I'd now seen what he saw. I immediately told him that we needed to go, and even though he was in a lot of pain, he didn't argue. I squatted down, getting ready to lift him up. I wrapped one of my arms under my dad's shoulders and pressed him up until we were both standing. I told him that I would do my best, but he was going to have to hop on his good leg. As we began making our way down the trail, we heard a knocking sound behind us. We both knew what made it, and it only made us want to move faster. But that only lasted a few hops, and my dad was quickly getting worn out.